start. Yeah, the previous session we touched on the data governance aspects, a little bit about the architecture around Information Steward, and the functionality, some of the principles behind exactly how the data flows through the application and how you can control that, and then how the functionality could influence your data quality management strategy or your data governance strategies. I'm going to start just by recapping some of the functionality or some of the modules of Information Steward now, and as the other people join, hopefully by then we'll be done, and then we can get into the technical details. So today's session is going to be a lot more technical in nature, although I think some of the principles you don't have to have a strong experience of Information Steward to understand what it is we're trying to impart, what knowledge it is I'm trying to impart to you. And then we're going to look practically in Information Steward at how this works, and I'll show you the examples, and then we'll leave some time for questions. I think people had quite a few technical questions last time, and perhaps because we ran out of time, maybe there were some people who wanted to ask a question but didn't get a chance to do so. Okay, so to start, if you remember, I mentioned that Information Steward is made up of these core modules. Now, these modules are effectively tabs on the application. So it's a browser-based application, as I said. It's a Flash application that runs on your web browser, and it can run either on the host server. You can run it from your PC, from a client, a PC or a workstation across the network. So it's a business tool. You don't need to have an application installed on your PC to be able to access the scorecards and to work in Information Steward. So Data Insight is the most widely used and probably the most should I say the heaviest user of the job server, which essentially does all the calculations, all the profiling, and the validation for Information Steward. You can create your rules, you can run your validation, you can monitor your data quality through the use of scorecards, and this is where effectively you can implement your business strategy around data quality management, and I'll explain that in more detail as we go along. Metadata management is really powerful in integration space. Strong impact analysis and data lineage. So if you would like to see what the effect would be of a change of a field in the source system, what that effect would be on your reports, this is quite powerful in that sense. If your reporting is also running on the business objects or SAP BI platform, you can effectively trace that field from source all the way through your cubes into your reports on the visualization or reporting layer. We can also see data structures, metadata of your data models in different systems. I think I mentioned previously the example of, for example, an ERP and a CRM system where you have customer master data in both. Typically one would be the master, for example, ERP, that would feed CRM, and CRM would then have a lot of data sitting around that customer object, enriching it, maybe linking it to a customer activity repository, or your accounting, your customer service centers, etc. Okay, and that's really nice to see what the differences and similarities are between those models by looking at the metadata. Cleansing packages, as I said, are your rules engines, effectively standardizing your data. Okay, this is a whole session on its own just to explain what how that works and what happens there. So we'll probably leave that for next time. But it is quite complex to set up properly, and you need a lot of hands-on massaging of this cleansing package to get it to work properly in some instances. Okay. Match review is all around deduplication. Effectively, Information Steward uses the data services job server to run a match on a data set, for example, a material or customer, and then it returns the probability, high probability matches, which it sees as possible duplicates. And then this is then presented in Information Steward. The business user or the data owner can then go and review that, select the master record, and then select the other records, the subordinate records and fields it would like to enrich the master records with. So then effectively you are building this rule for consolidating or deduplicating your data, and then that needs to get executed in data services, by data services, or manually via some sort of a process into your source system. Data Quality Advisor is not specifically a module, but it is a piece of functionality. It is a little tool that pops up when you run your profiling on a certain data set, and it just basically provides some basic rules, some recommended rules that we could then implement on our data set. It is still has to reach a high level of maturity, so the rules are quite basic, and it doesn't really take into account business logic in those rules. It's more technical rules, superficial, face value, should not be null, must be equal to X, or must be unique, that type of rule. So I'll show you that. So before we carry on, I'm just going to share my Information Steward screen, and then I can give you just run through these modules practically in Information. Oops. Okay, so this is Information Steward. Just want to go into the project quickly. Okay, so I'm hoping my screen is large enough. I'm going to zoom in slightly just so you can see. It's pretty easy to see our modules at the top. We have our data insight, we have our metadata management, we have our Metapedia, our cleansing package builder. As I said, the work list is just a very light task list, and it's role-based, not user-based. Okay. On the settings side, you can see that we can do match review configurations here. This is effectively where we set up these parameters to do our deduplication. Okay. We can also define, and I'll come back to this, custom attributes. Now, custom attributes are effectively custom fields that we can assign to most objects within Information Steward, whether it be a rule or a term in our Metapedia or whatever. We can link business terms to this as if you wish, and you can then create custom fields that allows you to identify and control a lot better. Maybe you want to define ownership of a specific rule rather than a data set. You can also do that, and that would be a custom field on that object. So data insight is made up of your workspace. This is where most of the work happens. You can see that we have some data sources that we've added here with tables, views, etc. Okay, we can execute some tasks, profiling the data. That's this view we have here. So you can see we're on the profile results tab. Okay, and then secondly, we have the rules results tab. Now, simply put, that's profiling and that's validation. So to have rule results, we need to have a rule. And the rule we create on the second little tab on the left here. And I'll go through the example that I've built earlier. Okay, Data Cleansing Advisor, as I said, this is that additional little piece of functionality. We typically use this just as a starting point on projects or on building rules, but effectively we find that most of the time these rules sort of fall away after being in place for a while, because the business value is not always there, and it can't apply that logic. It is nice for a quick assessment. If you want to do a rapid assessment, you can use some of these rules. And basically, when you're on the profiling view, on the profiling view, you'll see this little cog appear, and it says Launch Data Validation Advisor. So it basically proposes these rules for you. So it looks at patterns, and it just looks at the values and possible bad values. And you can literally click on the accept button, and then it should then open this editor for you, pre-populate the rule screen for you with some parameters and those values with the rule. It's not always 100% accurate. You might need to tweak it slightly. And then you can see there it's checking that status field MSTAE status is blank, but we know that that's not going to provide us any value, because in the example I use later, we would like a different value there. Okay, just going to cancel. Then the other important section is the scorecard setup. This is effectively where we configure the roll-up of our rules into our scorecard levels, our data domains and our quality dimensions. We'll come back to that in a little while. We can also set up some file formats. This is if we would like to import like a text file or something into Information Steward, and we're not connecting to a database or an application system. Okay, and then our tasks is if we run a rule or profiling task, basically these tasks appear over here. These tasks are schedulable. They appear on the platform, and they can be triggered or kicked off by a third-party scheduler like Control M or something similar, and that's quite powerful as well, because it places ownership on another department to manage the scheduling or to monitor the servers and the strain of the servers, so to ensure that they execute these jobs at the right time, so that there's no conflict. Yeah, so the tasks can be changed as well. So if, let's say, that top task has been scheduled by Control M, for example, we can then go and edit this task, and we can effectively add more tables to it. And you can see here, we can, for example, add some tables. We can set our sampling rates, and for a profiling job, this is a rule task, but if it was a profile, we can then go and set some additional parameters and settings for what type of data profiling we wish to do. If it's a text table, it's heavy in text, we would typically do your, let me actually show you, we would typically do your string-based profiling, like looking for word distribution, how often does a pattern occur, that sort of thing. Where median distribution and simple profiling basically looks at percentages, values, string lengths, and that sort of thing. Okay. You'll see that we don't have the option here of writing the failed data to a failed records database. That was a question that we had earlier. That's because profiling is statistical. It's just a report. There's no exceptions that come out of it yet. We haven't applied a rule to this task or this data set yet. Similar to rule task, we can obviously add some more data to this task. Okay. Yeah, I think maybe I was a bit unclear on that previously. Let me just go back to the rule task and show you. So if we run this task, I can then go and select and define a database where I'd like to store all my failed records. Because Information Steward only works with samples. You can see that we talk about max data sampling size. That's if you only wish to profile a subset of the data as a sample. You don't have to profile the entire data set. You can imagine tables like your BSEG or your EKPO, or your purchase order tables, your MBEW tables. They can be massive, even Marcy or Mark. You can have potentially hundreds of millions of records in those tables, and you don't want to profile the entire table, you just want to profile a sample. You can effectively change your input sampling rate to say I want to profile every fifth record, but only give me 100. So in that instance, I would typically look at, let's say, 10%. So if it's if it's 10 million records in the table, then I'd profile 1 million or or something similar, just because that's still pretty manageable in terms of profiling. Okay, so that's your frequency. So how often? So every fifth record, I want to pull a sample record, and I would like a million of those or 100,000 of those. Okay. There are limitations. You'll see that's too large, so you can just play and tweak that figure. You can also change these settings in config to increase or decrease them. Okay. One thing I didn't mention here is email notifications. You can set up notification once the job completes. You can be notified whether there's a failure or success, etc. Okay, so that basically covers data insight. Metadata management is not for today's session, but as I said, this is where you can pull in these different models of your data and effectively tables, fields, schemas. You can go into a lot of detail around the metadata and the models. You can see these tables. So there's a material. You can view the data. You can view the profiling results, the impact, the lineage, etc. On here. Okay. Metapedia, as we said, this is your business glossary. It's quite nifty. Let's say, for example, we have a material master. We have MRP views that we would like to provide some information on, and we know that on MRP1 we have an ABC indicator, and then this basically tells you what the term means. What does ABC indicator mean? And you can then define this, and this business glossary or dictionary, if you will, can then be exposed to the entire business, and this helps everybody essentially to speak the same language. There's common understanding. Some fields might mean different things to different departments. You can imagine that could cause a lot of confusion. Okay, so you can build these terms essentially centrally and expose that. Cleansing packages I'm not going to go into. As I said, that's around standardization, and if anybody would like to see how that works, we do have a short demo, and I'm happy to share that with you if you contact me after this session. Okay, I'm just going to pop back to the presentation, and then we can carry on. Please share that with you. Oh, wrong one. Okay. Not saying it's shared on my end. Okay, I think that's the better. Okay, so jumping into some advanced aspects of Information Steward. I'm not going to go through all the functionality. I've touched briefly on it now, as you've seen, just to show you what it is. My assumption is that you may have seen that already, and that you may have actually built a rule and run a bit of a profile. If not, bear with us. The principles here still might be valuable. And this the whole idea behind this is just to impart some knowledge that we've gained over time. We find at our various customers that it takes a while to become comfortable with Information Steward as an application and exactly how it sits inside your data quality strategy. So there's some learnings and some fundamentals that come only after you've been using the tool for a while. And it's important to have those up front. And some of it are not really apparent to analysts who simply use the tool day to day. They don't scratch around in the data, they're not involved in the staging or the extraction of the data. So it's very difficult, you're quite limited in what you're capable of doing within that end-to-end data flow and analysis flow. So especially around the two areas of the data insight module that I touched on, which is the rules and the scoring. Now rules, we like to call that rules thinking. There are obviously many different ways in which you can approach designing a rule. For us, we've come up with what we feel is a very basic and generic way. Not all of the steps are always applicable, but they are defined, so you can apply those steps if you wish. And then scoring, which in our mind is arguably the most effective means of managing your business's data quality strategy. Okay, the scorecard becomes, if you manage it properly, it can become a living thing, and you can change your employees' focus around which areas you wish them to spend their time on. You can assign priority effectively without users being really aware of that. And I'll explain that in a bit more detail. So these are the two areas I'm going to cover. There are obviously other principles and other objects that we're not touching today, but these are for us two of the more important ones. Okay. So if we're looking at these, or before we look at these, I just wanted to recap this so that we all understand exactly what happens on the back end. Okay. So what we have here is we have Information Steward as the front-end application. We design our rule and our scorecard, but let's say we design our rule, or when I say we design, we've configured the rule and we've basically assigned it a field. We've bound it to a specific field to test the quality of that field in a table or a view. Similarly, we have set up a table in Information Steward, and we've assigned it to a profiling task. So that's also a task to profile the data. That gets submitted, that task gets submitted to the data services job server. So this is where Information Steward is heavily reliant on data services. The job server does all the heavy work. It does the heavy lifting. That task is telling it which table, in which database, or which application we wish to look at. It then goes and extracts that from our source data. Okay, and that can be, there's many options there, from applications, databases, even files, different technologies, can be integrated here. So it pulls the data and then does the calculation. Once it's done the calculation, it returns the result, whether that's now our profiling result or our scores on our rules and fields. Okay, so that's the very basic process of what happens behind the scenes. So Information Steward itself does not churn. It does not execute anything. It submits tasks to the job server, which sits separate. So that keeps the presentation layer effectively separate from the data and calculation layer. Okay, so you can see that if we overload this job server, or we don't configure our source data properly, we can have a breakdown in this process without even knowing. Okay, and that's why I say that by properly managing the job server tasks, we can improve or we can have achieve better results, both in terms of accuracy and performance. Okay, the accuracy we're going to get to in a second. The performance, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. You don't want to run 20 tasks, heavy tasks at the same time that flatline your server, for example. Okay. So, going into the detail around rules thinking. A rule is effectively a validation function. So, if you have some coding background, you would know that a function, or a method, I think it's called in some speak, has parameters. I have to pass the rule something. So, this might be my field, for example, my product status. We have filters. So, let's say I would like to exclude any statuses that are inactive or discontinued for a product. I can filter that. So what the filter does, the filter sits on the rule itself and basically influences the query that's sent to the database or the data source to get the data that it needs to validate. All right. So you're actually pushing down this in terms if you think of it in terms of SQL, as a where clause. Okay. And the condition is internal to the rule. This is typically your if then else, or your where. Now, the important thing to note here is that conditions, if not individually defined, are mutually exclusive. So if I can give you an example of that, is if I go if status active, what happens to the inactive statuses? Because those are still part of my data set that I've brought back in my query. So what I need to do with those, because a rule has to assign a true or a false, it has to give a result to every record. And if you're doing an if status active, by not defining anything on the set that you've excluded, those would by default either pass or fail, and that skews your result. Okay, I do go into that in a bit more detail. So each of these elements and components, as you can see, have a very different and sometimes very important role. The impacts are different, and that can be in terms of performance or your end result. As I said, the rule is then applied to that data set. Okay, and this data set's definition is extremely important, and this is where we're going to start with our rules thinking as well. Each record in that set is then passed through the rule. As I said, we receive a true or a false, and you can see that when you design a rule, you actually have to start at the source. You have to start, with the data that you're going to be looking at. Okay, that's very important. When we look at complex rules, so that's a rule that has a couple of ifs embedded. Maybe you've got whiles, you've got maybe some complex regular expression type validation that's happening. You have quite a few parameters, so your field that you are validating is very dependent on other fields, the results of other fields. Then the rule becomes complex. Okay, and complex rules have, with those dependencies, they end up having a lot of calculation steps, and the job server has to work a lot harder to process those, and you'll typically end up with jobs taking half an hour to an hour, maybe even more in some cases. Okay, in those instances, I always say it's advisable to keep it simple. Have one rule, test one thing. So you can even split it. So let's say you're looking at product status. Coming back to our previous example, I can have one rule basically apply to active products and one rule apply to inactive products. I don't have to combine them in a single rule. Okay, that keeps things very simple. It removes a whole level within my condition, because now I have another if that falls out that I can remove, and basically then simplifies the rest of the rule. Okay, we would like to try and limit our data set as much as possible. Now the principle here being that if my rule does not apply, if my rule does not apply to some of the data, why do I want to validate the data with that rule? I'm going to get the wrong result. I'm going to get a skewing of my score. Okay, I see there's a question. We will be sharing this presentation later and the videos. Okay, so don't worry about that. If you have to go, please, you're excused. And you can have a look at that content later. Okay, so as I said, our data work, our data prep is very important. That's why I say we pre-stage the data or our complex views. So we don't want information steward. You would have seen that I built some views. We don't want those views to become too large. I don't want 3-4 tables joined in one view, because the job server has to run those joins in memory and provide the data to information steward. Remember, information steward doesn't hold that data. I can't come back and dive into it and slice and dice it. I need to do that with data services on the data source effectively. All information steward does is provide me the stats and figures and the metadata. So by doing some pre-stage work and building your complex data structures beforehand, let's say, for example, in our status, we want to look at our material status, our cross-plant status, and our site-specific or plant-specific status. Those are in 2 separate tables, and we want to join those, but we know that the one is actually Marcy, that has our MRP views, etc. So Marcy being a big table, joining that tomorrow, we can end up with quite a huge chunk of data sitting in memory, making everything very slow. So rather join it with data services, have basically a permanent view, that you can then stage or persist in the database, and just have that as a table in IS. Now it's technically not a view anymore. In business terms, it's a view, but technically it's now simply a table. That's what the pre-stage means. Okay. Now rules exist on their own, testing one thing, but now we've got a lot of rules that are tied to that business view, the MRP specific data. So we want to look at all rules together, all relevant rules together, so that effectively we can see where there's overlap. Maybe we're validating some things twice. as I said, you can split your rule. One rule to look at active materials or products, and another rule to look at inactive or discontinued materials and products. If I've got a third rule, excuse me, that has a condition that says if active, I'm basically, revalidating the same data set. And this provides you then an overall idea, of how you can split and how you can manage, so you limit your rework effectively. I hope that makes sense. So as I mentioned, we can use custom fields to then just provide further information and improve the usability, of the objects within Information Steward, so that if I need to make a change to a rule, I can see, okay, hang on, Peter is the owner, I need to run this by him first. Okay. So I've basically summarized this into 3 steps. So the first step is to define the broad scope, the business area. This is basically looking at the source data. And as I've said, our business area might be materials resource planning. It might be a subset of that, looking at plant-specific data. And we would then identify our source data, and we know that those are our tables. So your broad scope is actually material master. Okay. Then we look at the subset of this entire data set relevant for the validation. So I don't want to pull in every single table. I mean, this can be massive. Essentially, we just want those that we're interested in, which would be, in our example, MARA, our material master, and MARCI, our site-specific data. And then we can see that, I'll make the comment here, that typically this subset is shared among multiple rules. So that subset, the MARA MARCI view, as I explained before, can be used by a few different rules. So you don't have to restage this data for every rule. I mean, I don't want to end up with 10 MARA MARCI tables all exactly the same. I want to reuse, and I want to save rework in that regard. So then I build up effectively a mini cube, if you will, and then apply my rules on that cube. Okay. I'll make the mention that there's a score impact here as well, and data that you exclude from your extraction point. So if I'm extracting data and I'm not looking at let's say purchasing or sales org data, I'm excluding those. So those are not going to be part of calculation, of score calculation. Similarly, if within a data set I'm only going to extract active data, my discontinued data I have no view of, my discontinued product, sorry. If I now try and validate and I'm looking for discontinued products, I'm going to get a score of 100% because there's none. That's the impact that it has on the score. Okay, so by limiting your data set, you can see that already, I'm not even in Information Steward yet, but already when I get there, there's going to be a massive impact. Okay, on the rule, we then have filtering, and this is the second step of defining the scope. We can provide further detail. This is now where the individual rule comes in. So step 1 is for across all rules, and step 2 is for individual rules. So on the individual rule, I only want to look at active materials. Okay. My pre-staging has all material statuses. So now I want to, for the rule, only validate active. So then I can put the status equals active in my filter. That then submits the query. As you can see here, the query goes to the source extraction, which data services job server manages. Okay, and then it brings back that result set, excluding obviously the discontinued or inactive statuses. Okay, now you can see that data set is now coming into the job server, and the job server is going to apply that condition for validation here. Okay, so anything that's not here is not included. So again, that data is excluded by filtering. Okay, and therefore it won't be scored. Okay, the combination of these two, the source data business area and then applying filtering, okay, define the context of my data. The context being the data that I want to validate. Okay, and I validate with a condition in my rule. That's the code, basically. That's the thinking of semantics, but semantics is the wordy description. But that's your technical rule, effectively, to validate. Okay. If I exclude data in the condition, I need to include it for scoring. This is coming back to my comment about having that default. So should I have an if statement in my rule? If status active, then check another, apply the validation. So check that it's, not status 7, that it's maybe a 4. What happens to the inactive? I've got an if status active, but I need to tell the rule what to do with inactive. Otherwise, it's going to skew my result. Okay, because I'm not validating that data. So then I'm inherently saying that it's valid, effectively. Okay. The job server then takes care of that and then returns the score to information steward. Okay. The example here, as I said, is effectively having a rule that, for example, says a discontinued product with a cross-plant status, okay, of discontinued should be discontinued for all sites and plants. Now, this comes down to a risk that was highlighted on another project we won, where the cross-plant status was made as was set to discontinued for an article at a retailer. Okay, but then they started trading that article again a few months later. They thought they were going to discontinue it, and they did in the system, but then they started trading with that product again. But as soon as they activated the status to start to procure, because now there's no stock in the warehouse, it actually opened the article at some sites for ordering and for trading. So now people were placing orders on zero stock article, resulting in massive delays and lost revenue, because orders were cancelled. They had to import this product from overseas, which took about 3 weeks. So it was a big problem. So they wanted a rule that basically said that if the article is discontinued at a global level, or client level, effectively, it should be discontinued for all sites and plants. And then we've basically built a validation rule into the ERP system with BRF that said, on a user exit, if they try to change the cross-plant status to discontinued, it must validate that the status is discontinued for all sites and plants for that product. If it wasn't, it wouldn't allow you to change this cross-plant status to discontinued. So you can see that becomes a very powerful business rule to have. It reduces your risk at the end of the day. Okay, so we define our business area as our MRP data. Okay, we filter or data with a discontinued status. Now notice that in this scenario, I'm not interested in the active status. I don't want to include it because I only want to validate data with where the cross-plant status is discontinued. I'm hoping that there are instances where cross-plant status is discontinued, but site status is still active. Okay, those are the ones I want to highlight. Those are my exceptions. That's what I don't want to allow. And then I can go and fix those. Okay, so we've defined our context as looking only at discontinued cross-plant status products. And then our validation would be that if cross-plant status is discontinued, then for each site plant, a product plant combination, the status should also be discontinued. Okay. Now, in terms of our scoring, which is the second principle that I wanted to cover, I'm also going to highlight basically the functionality that Information Steward has to have many rules bound to one field or one rule bound to many different fields. Okay, so that many-to-many type relationship it becomes quite complex to manage. But Information Steward provides us some functionality and the ability to control the priority we wish to set on some of those rule field relationships, and then also as they become aggregated, because that's what scoring is. It gives me a score on a specific field for a rule. But then I can aggregate those into specific areas. I can look at data quality dimensions, like for example, I wish to check the completeness of my data, or the accuracy, or the consistency, or the timeliness thereof. Those are data quality dimensions that I wish to measure. Alternatively, I can group it by data object, so looking at all my customer rules in one view, or all my material rules in another view. I can go even further and drill down from my material into, let's say, MRP data, your procurement, or maybe your sales views. Similarly with customers. So it does provide a lot of flexibility to build and design the business-specific view of the data quality that you wish to see. Okay. Now, the scoring is heavily influenced by the defaults, as I said, and this can skew results. I've explained that. And you can imagine that if that happens on every rule and I aggregate my scores, what my end result would be. Okay, so that's why I say scores and weightings are arguably the most influential aspects of information steward for data governance. And when I talk data governance here, I talk specifically about the ownership of that as well. So, we would have an owner defined for a set of data, let's say procurement data set, and if that score is bad, that person is responsible to get it fixed. So by changing scores and weightings, you can change the intensity of the focus that person has on sorting out that problem. So you can weight one area more than another area, but that starts at a rule level, where you can even weight individual rules. Okay. So the two areas I've touched on is the binding. So it's the rule field relationship. Okay. And the binding holds the score for the individual rule field combination. That gets aggregated, and this is where we come to the scorecard weighting, and we can weight within the scorecards certain subsections or certain pieces of those aggregated views. Okay. Thresholds is something that's more visual, so that happens on a binding effectively, but then when you aggregate it basically determines what color to make your score. Let's say data is not really business critical. If it's below 60%, then you can make it red. If it's between 60 and 75, you can make it amber, and then above 75 is green. Now, in some instances, data is very critical, and you cannot afford even one exception. In that case, you would just set the thresholds all to 100%, which means that if it's 99.9%, it will highlight it and say, listen, there's one or two or a few records here that need attention, that are posing a big business risk. So that's what the threshold effectively does, is it changes that focus. If I'm seeing green, I'm not going to be too bothered. If I'm seeing red, lights are flashing. Okay. I want to explain here now how the rule context affects the scoring. Okay, and this is a simple example. Looking at the material master with, for example, 100,000 materials, we wish to then prep this data, this material data, for our IS scoring, and we extract it. So at our extraction, we are only looking at active materials. We're not interested in inactive or discontinued materials. So you can see that about 65% now are active in this example. So we've now decreased our data set effectively by 35%. Okay. Now this is my source. The second step, remember, the second step for defining context is the rule filter. If I now apply this rule to this data set, I can go and exclude non-trade materials. Let's say maybe only materials like merchandise or sales type materials, that you don't actually buy and sell. If you exclude those, we can limit the data set even further. And in this example, we can limit it by another 30,000. Now that's 30,000 of the 65,000, so it's almost 50% that I can now decrease that data set again. 30% overall of the 100,000. I'm left with about 35,000 tradable active materials. Okay, this is where I want to apply my condition. I do my validation, and I get a result of 80% on a pass and 20% fail. But remember, this is 80% and 20% of my context, of my prepped data, the applicable and relevant data set that I wish to apply my rule on. If I were not to do this this data preparation and filtering, I would end up with a scenario where I would still receive, my rule would still run on this material master data. I would still get 28,000 materials passing the condition, but now my score would be 28,000 out of 100,000, because I've got none of this in the middle happening here. I'm applying that condition directly onto the source. So my score is 28%. So you can see that my figures are greatly skewed because the inactive and non-trade data I'm not even interested in are now not valid. Doesn't mean that they're not valid. A non-trade material which is active is completely fine, you know. I mean, that's part of the normal business process. So I hope you can see that it's actually a bit of a no-brainer. You need to do this data preparation and define this context in order to gain value out of your scores. So without the context, you know, we can have a massive difference in the score we receive and how we interpret it. And by extension, without context defined, if I just apply that blanket rule, I effectively can only achieve a 35% data quality. If all of these were passed validation, I would only have 35,000 materials out of the 100,000 ever that are valid for that condition. So I can't get more than a 35% score. Okay, and this is something we see often where the scores typically hover around 70 or 80% at businesses. You know, they keep driving to try and get that other 20%, but it's difficult, you know, and it sort of falls by the wayside because it's acceptable, you know, but you don't realize that actually you might be closer to 100%. Or maybe even lower, you know, as a converse. And this should drive you then to go and investigate exactly how you can better provide context to the rule. Okay. So I built a quick little scenario here just to explain to you what happens in Information Steward. So you'll see that we have a field here, material status. Okay. I've got exactly the same rule looking at those discontinued products at a cross-plant level from before. And you can see that where I have the rule that says no filter at the bottom here, the score is higher. Okay, but you can see that my failed records are exactly the same. Going back here, remember my condition, whether it's applied to my context or whether it's applied to the material master as a whole, I'm always going to get that 28,000 records that pass. So those 153 will be the same for those two rules if the rule is exactly the rules are similar. So by adding a filter though, I can limit the data set. So you see here where we have a filter on the first rule, I've only processed about 15,000 records. So my score is the 153 of about 15,000. Where without having a filter, I'm now going you know, straight to the larger data set, running everything, and I'm processing 1.1 million records. So my 153 out of 1.1 million is 9,99999 something. So I only see two decimal places here. So you can see that there's a very material difference in the score at the end of the day, and it shows the score is a lot better than what it actually is. Okay. So I've got a bit of an example here, and I'm going to leave this for you to read through, but this comes down to the principle that business can now decide to weight your dimensions that you wish to check. So if I've got a complete data set which is now validated at 60% complete, the blue out of the larger block there, as you can see, and I have accuracy, my accuracy basically can only validate data which I have, which is my complete data set. So you can see that when I test accuracy, I'm only looking at the data that I have present and existing in the system, but there's a larger data set here where I don't have the relevant data. So I've got nothing to validate. Now that's where the default comes in, and that's where the figures become skewed. Okay. Now you can argue, obviously, that yes, there is no data, but it should be blank or it should be a null. Then yes, fine, that would become part of your data set, and you would validate for that. Okay. But by doing it by default, I need to decide whether I'm going to either pass or fail that data. So now business can decide, listen, let's focus on getting this data in. Let's go on a data capturing, on data enrichment exercise. Drive our completeness up closer to 90%, which means that my accuracy score for the overall data set is gonna improve greatly. Okay, and then I've got more data to validate for accuracy. Okay. You'll notice that by changing the weighting and changing the priority of what the business would like employees to focus on, we haven't changed any of the rules. I haven't changed any rule logic. The only thing that I've maybe touched is filtering on the rule itself. And typically that's defined up front as part of your context, and you don't have to change the rule condition. Okay, so the scorecard weighting does not impact the rule logic, essentially. All right. So just before we go into Q&A, I'm going to share my information steward screen with you again, and then I'll just show you the practical example in the system of what I've summarized there. Okay, you should be able to see that still. Okay, so the first step in the process of defining context for me was to look at the source data. So basically the rule being, I just want to jump back to that, the rule being that a discontinued product at a client or a cross-plant level should be discontinued for all sites and plants, plant extensions. Okay, so I know, or if you don't, then you get an SAP functional person to help you, that we're looking at two tables. We're looking at the tables MARA and MARCI. But by pulling them into Information Steward as two separate tables, there's no relationship between these two, technically. I mean, I'm not using the primary keys, I'm not using material to join them, a material number. So I need to go and build that structure, and that's where the data preparation comes in. So effectively you can use data services, join them, pull them in as a third table here called MARA MARCI, on which I then go and apply my rule. For profiling, I can keep them separate. There's no issue with that. Okay. If, however, you would like to see an overall profile and you'd like to limit the number of fields, remember, limitation of data is not only the number of records, it's also the number of fields, how wide your tables are. I then went and I built a little view here, and I literally just pulled in some key fields, and you can see that it's a handful of fields compared to the total. All right, and the ones I'm interested in are MMSTA, which is our cross-plant status, MSTAE, which is cross-plant status, and MMSTA, which is our plant level status. Okay, so by pulling in those two with our material number, we can now identify the material and the plant vags combinations where we have data issues, and then we need to go and fix. So we're looking for those exceptions. So this is our profiling result. We can see that, okay, and with profiling, this provides a lot of value because now we can see what types of flags and statuses do we have here. So you'll see that for cross-plant status, for example, I've got to the right here, I've got about 5 unique values. Okay, I've got a pattern of 2 characters. Okay, and 5 words would effectively would be those values. If I click on that, it's going to provide me some more info. I'm just going to go here so you can see where we were. So you can see that now we have 5 statuses. We have a blank, and that makes up about 97%, 98%, sorry, of the total, which basically, to my mind, means that blank actually means active, because D, I know, means discontinued. Okay. So next we need to look at our plant-specific status. So we're looking at this field here, and we see that there are many more values here. Now I know that to be true because I don't, for MRP and procurement, etc., I don't control that at a client level. I control that at a plant level. So I can see statuses here, like let's say maybe blocked for procurement, or flagged for, well, not flagged for, sorry, inactive. That's before being discontinued. You might have two separate statuses for that. So this basically just depends on your business and how you control these statuses. And this comes from, obviously, from config. You configure these values and then you assign them to the product, and that has a business process implication. All right. So the profiling provides us now some insight into how we're going to apply this rule. So I have not limited this data set at all. This is looking at all statuses. You can see both active and inactive statuses are part of this. By clicking here, you can see I've got a sample at the bottom, typically only about 100 records, but it's a sample nonetheless that provides some value. And I can go and interrogate and see where there may be some combinations, etc. Okay. The next step here is for us to define our rule. So I've built a rule here already. If I open the rule, okay. Typically we have to give it a unique name, and you can follow naming conventions. Maybe you have standards or guiding principles of use that you have in your business. Give it a naming convention. The description, we typically like to put the business rule. Okay. Which is also very nice to have is, this is a text field. You can add a lot of content here, but this effectively allows you to provide a lot more background information. You can maybe even put impacts on here, which is nice for somebody who maybe not part of a specific business process. So the data analyst can understand what the impact is. So he knows if it's a financial impact, he can focus on data quality aspects related to financial implications. If the analyst feels that she needs to focus more on process efficiency, then they can change the focus slightly of how they validate. You see. Custom attributes I touched on. So we don't have any custom attributes defined here, but we can go and add additional fields here to the rule that just provides additional information, maybe links to process or ownership, etc. I'll show you how to do that in a second. You'll see that on this rule, I've bound the rule already, so I'm not able to edit these, but we can add the parameters. Remember I said a rule is like a function, so we've got our parameters. We're interested in cross-plant status, because that's what we're checking. That's our condition, essentially. And then we're looking at our MRP or plant-specific status. Okay. Now, because we're validating that plant-specific status is a certain value based on cross-plant status, plant-specific status is the important field. That's the one that I want to score. Okay, so I've ticked that as scoring. And you can see that I've got a filter here saying cross-plant status is equal to D. So I'm only looking at data, all the records where my global status is D, and then I'm validating that it's the cross-plant status either discontinued, closed, or status 03, whatever that might mean. Okay, and that's basically my rule. I then bind my rule to that field. Okay, so binding, I select my data. Now you'll see that for my parameters, I like to put the field name as the description, because now I can see what field to bind it to. It's a little trick, then you're not running around, because typically these fields are all technical field names. So then I know that I can bind it to MSTAE, and this one I need to bind to MMSTA. I can set my thresholds, and I've explained exactly what that means. So if this was a critical field, I can make it 100%. So anything less than that will be flagged as red and would require attention. Okay. I already have this binding in place, so I'm just going to close that. And you can see that I've now run my validation. And now we can go to our rule results. And you'll see on this table or view, the fields that have a rule bound to it have that little cog on them. So I can drop down that cog. And this is from my example that I had earlier where the one rule had a filter and the other rule did not have a filter. Okay, and you can see the impact of the total there. So as a percentage of the total, not having a filter is looking at all the data and by default passing anything that's that doesn't fulfill the condition. Okay. Now over time you're going to see trends. Every time you run this, this trend can go up and down based on how the data quality changes. But now, as I said, we're interested in these 153. I need to go and fix this. Okay. So I can look at my output. Now there's a lot of fields here, so let's just limit what we're looking at here. I want that field. I want the material number. Yeah, so those are the ones I'm interested in. I can put like that. So we can see that for this material, my cross-plant status, my cross-plant status is discontinued. That's what I had in my filter. So I'm only looking at those that subset of the data. But I can see that my plant-specific status is blank, which means it's active. And this is something that I want to fix based on my business rule. And then I can go to my transaction, and I can go and maintain the status here on the MRP view, okay, for this plant. You can see that this material now, seems like there's multiple plants with an issue. We can actually sort them. So there you can see there's multiple issues. So somebody's gone and discontinued this at a client level, but then have not done it at a plant level. If that has to become active, you see these statuses are now immediately active and open for trading. Okay, I hope that provided you some insight. That's my presentation pretty much done for now, and I'm going to open to any questions you might have.